Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and in today's podcast we return to the vitally important, hugely complicated and normally highly emotive subject of planning reform. The UK's planning system has long been a battleground between the need for economic growth and the challenges of bureaucracy, local opposition and environmental concerns. And as the government pushes forward with ambitious targets for building 1.5 million homes, upgrading transport networks and accelerating clean energy projects, the speed at which infrastructure is planned and delivered has never been more critical. Yet delays remain a persistent problem. As we know, major projects can take years to navigate the approvals process, with judicial reviews and lengthy consultations slowing progress. But help is at hand in the form of the long-awaited Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which was published last week and heralded by the government as providing transformative reforms to get Britain building, tackle blockers and unleash billions in economic growth. This proposed legislation includes changes to the infrastructure planning, environmental impact assessments and compulsory purchase powers, and, as discussed on the podcast before Christmas, limits on the role of judicial reviews. But will these changes truly unlock growth, or are deeper structural issues being overlooked? And how can the planning system ensure that infrastructure projects not only proceed faster but also deliver better outcomes for communities and the environment? Big questions. So who better to bring back to the Infrastructure Podcast to explain and to chew over this potential new dawn of planning than Robbie Owen, infrastructure planning guru and partner at law firm Pinsent Masons. Robbie, I believe I'm interrupting your hard work at Mippin in the south of France sunshine, so apologies, but welcome back to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you, Anthony. It's great to be back. And yes, I'm speaking to you from Cannes, attending the Mippin global property event. And yes, I've managed to find some huddles and corners to read the bill in part. And so, yeah, delighted to be here to talk to you about it.
Fabulous. Well, Robbie, we spoke just before Christmas about the potential of the new Planning and Infrastructure Bill to radically accelerate planning and delivery of infrastructure investment. I mean, the government describes this new bill as transformative. So, do you think it will meaningfully speed up infrastructure delivery, or are key obstacles still left unaddressed?
I think it'll certainly help. There is a lot of good stuff in it, and government are separately from the bill, where primary legislation is not needed. They're busy trying to improve the infrastructure planning regimes that we have. I think the effect of the bill has been rather overstated by ministers. It's been referred to as being evolution by revolution and the biggest change in a generation. I think that's rather overhyped, if I can put it that way.
You don't sound very excited, I must say.
No, I mean, I really welcome the bill. There's some great stuff in it. I don't think it goes far enough, though, and I think ministers will need to come back with another bill in a year or so's time, because I think more far-reaching changes are going to be needed. Yeah,
well, I mean, ministers aim to make 150 decisions on nationally significant infrastructure projects in this Parliament. I mean, you say that none of the measures discussed are a silver bullet. With what we see now, I mean, how realistic is the target?
Well, I think that the government's going to need to think further about judicial review, because we have coming a long list of important transport and energy and water infrastructure projects. A lot of them are really quite controversial, and I don't think that, particularly in relation to judicial review, the changes go far enough. The changes to judicial review are really very modest, and that is not being made clear. They're being, as I say, the rhetoric, both in relation to judicial review changes, but also other changes that are in the bill, is a considerable way ahead of reality. It seems to me.
Well, because when we spoke before Christmas, the discussion we had there was around reducing the number of bites of the cherry, effectively, that you can make for a judicial review. Does that not go far enough for you now?
No, it doesn't go far enough, because the bill is only reducing the number of attempts you are allowed to have to seek the court's permission to bring the judicial review in the first place, because under judicial review procedures, you need to get the court's permission to bring the claim. And then if you are successful with being given permission, you then proceed with the claim itself and you go to a substantive hearing. And the changes the bill is making is only reducing the number of attempts you are being given to seek permission from 3 to 2 in most cases, although in the case of a claim certified by the judge as being totally without merit, which is a very high bar, then you're not allowed to appeal from the High Court's decision denying you permission. So that is what the bill is doing. It's not changing the substantive procedures for judicial review once you get permission. And I think in particular, what government should be doing to go further is to abolish the permission stage altogether. We have, in relation to a similar procedure to judicial review called statutory review, we don't have a permission stage, and that saves a lot of time. Recently, for example, in relation to a judicial review of the A66 development consent order for National Highways Northern Transpennine project, the DCO was made in March last year, and it took until the middle of January this year for the permission stage to be dispensed with. In the end, the Court of Appeal agreed with the High Court and denied the claimant permission, but that took 10 and a half months. So I think you get the point that if it still takes even say 8 months to get permission with an appeal to the Court of Appeal, if permission is then given, you then go back to the start of the process, if you like, for the substantive hearing.
Is there any traction on your idea to push more of these decisions up to Parliament?
I've had a lot of interest in this idea, and I'm going to be developing it further. And in fact, I am doing a podcast with the Hansard Society later today because they have picked up on this following a letter I had published in the Times at the beginning of February. I think, to be honest, government have been very busy getting this bill done and introduced into Parliament. And I'm hoping that now that that's been done, although, of course, the parliamentary passage now has to start, I'm hoping that they will be interested in looking at this idea further.
Yeah. And that could form some secondary legislation, perhaps, that comes through afterwards.
Well, no, I think if the government are prepared to make provision for Parliament to get involved in some infrastructure in the way I suggested, that would require additional primary legislation, which would need to be done in a further planning bill.
So some good stuff, some bad. So what's the talk of the town in Mippin? Perhaps you say not the silver bullet, but what are developers? Are they pleased with progress? I
think developers are really pleased with progress. They're very pleased with the government's commitment, which is extremely clear and forthright to reform planning generally, both in relation to infrastructure planning and development planning. And there's a lot of good feeling about this, and it is creating a degree of confidence. Mm-hmm. Clearly, the industry realises that government's got to these reforms need to be completed and implemented. There's still lots to be done, and government is determined to get this bill through in short order at the same time as the bill is going through, to consult on draft secondary legislation, guidance, and other things needed to implement the whole package. So talk of the town is encouraging, but we're not convinced it yet goes far enough.
Yep, because there's a lot of work to do. I mean, the bill proposes regular updates, for instance, to national policy statements, which that should create a more agile planning system. But could it also introduce more uncertainties for developers?
Well, I think having a more up-to-date system for national policy statements, which inform how applications for development consent orders are prepared and then determined, there's no doubt that in recent years, the fact that our national policy statements have got out of date has led to more legal challenges. So having a system of national policy statements that are kept up to date every 5 years, as is the proposal, is absolutely to be welcomed. And we've been asking for this for a number of years now. I think there's a lot of detail to actually work out how this is going to be done and how Whitehall are going to do this. We have around 15 national policy statements, and I think that further work does need to be done in the medium term to consider, as per a recommendation from the National Infrastructure Commission, whether a more modular system of national policy statements is to be preferred, because it's just easier to keep up to date. Because updating up to 15 NPSs across the different Whitehall departments is really quite a task. And so I think this is absolutely encouraging and very welcome, but more work on the NPS element of the planning regime is required, I think.
Okay, well, there's two areas that the government's really trying to use planning reform to accelerate delivery across the infrastructure sector. The first is in housing, and of course to try to deliver this 1.5 million homes target over the next 5 years. But let's start with the government's second major ambition, which is to transition the UK energy infrastructure away from fossil fuels. And the bill seeks to make Britain a clean energy superpower. So for you, given the challenges around planning, which are really holding back quite a lot of that investment, does it go far enough in removing the barriers to specifically renewable energy projects?
Well, I think it's really the same answer, Anthony, as I gave earlier in relation to infrastructure generally. I don't think it does go quite far enough. I think, for example, in relation to all types of infrastructure, not just renewable energy, the pre-application process for nationally significant infrastructure projects is still very complicated. And although there are some welcome changes and simplifications to the consultation requirements pre-application, I think the fact remains that the pre-application stage is hugely complicated. It's very difficult for applicants to get all of these statutory consultees engaged and responding in time. There are a number of detailed issues like that where government still need to think through what they're planning to do. So, for example, should there be a general power to modify the process that can then be on a individual case-by-case basis exercised to, for example, reduce procedural requirements if in the particular case concerned they're just not necessary.
I mean, it's interesting because, the headlines that followed this publication when it came to energy focused on this £250 for locals affected by pylons or energy infrastructure. I mean, the reality is it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, will that make an impact or just add cost?
Well, I think the whole issue of what we call community benefit is a very live one, and government, both this administration and the previous government, have been focusing when it comes to community benefit in relation to electricity transmission projects. But I think in reality, we need a much broader review of community benefit across all of the infrastructure sectors to look at what a good community benefit scheme looks like. And therefore, I mean, whether £2,500 over 10 years is the right approach, some may well consider it to be rather sort of superficial, almost bribery in a way. I imagine it's going to be said. I'm rather sceptical.
Right. I mean, because I've mentioned before the ideas by people like Greg Jackson to really kind of focus on local benefits by actually coming up with more substantive schemes which drive the energy, the low cost energy, to local communities. That's a slightly more complicated process. Do you think that will ever make it forward to a workable proposal?
Well, I think government does understand, and this was indeed in their manifesto, the need to address community benefit in a much more comprehensive way than has been done to date. But what we see in this bill is just one proposal in relation to benefits for householders living within, I think it's 500 metres is the proposal of electricity transmission projects. And as I say, I think government needs to look at this much more in the round in relation to different types of renewable energy infrastructure and other energy infrastructure, and indeed other infrastructure like water and transport. I don't think it's an issue that is just a live one for electricity transmission projects.
Well, we discussed in December, and we just picked up just now about this, the judicial review issue, often delaying major infrastructure projects. And the bill, as we said, proposes changes which you say don't necessarily go fast enough. But is there the right balance being struck between speed of delivery, legal scrutiny, and also community involvement?
Well, I think let's not forget, in relation to nationally significant infrastructure projects, you have a system of community involvement through the whole pre-application process with extensive consultation requirements still, although they are being changed in the bill. You have community involvement through the whole examination of an application, which can be for up to 6 months, and in practice is normally around 6 months. So you have a lot of provision already, much more so than with the Town and Country Planning Act system, for communities to be involved in applications for development consent for nationally significant infrastructure projects. And the judicial review, of course, is a system we have for the courts to decide if ministers have acted within the law in giving consent for a project. And as I said earlier, it feels to me that the changes made by the bill in relation to judicial review are too timid. And I think that at the moment there is not the right balance being struck between the need for these projects, which are by definition nationally significant, the clue's in the name. I don't think there is the right balance being struck between the need for the projects to be delivered once they've been approved without undue delay, and the right for individuals to question lawfulness of decisions made.
But it's hard because the government doesn't want to. Developers, in reality, they don't want to alienate communities affected by these large projects. So, there has to be that balance struck. And I suppose, the streamlining of the development consent order, for instance, will that make a meaningful difference? Or are deeper systemic changes needed to ensure faster project approval while keeping those local communities on board?
I think the first point to make is I haven't done a precise analysis, but I think it's the case if you analyse all of the judicial reviews we've had of nationally significant infrastructure project decisions, most of them have not been brought by local communities at all. They've been brought by national campaign groups like Transport Actions Network and others like that. But I don't believe that deeper systemic change is needed. The infrastructure planning regimes we have, both under the Planning Act but also for transport infrastructure, I think are largely fit for purpose. But further work is required. If you look at the planning working paper that preceded this bill and was published towards the end of January, there are further proposals in that bill for legislation that aren't yet in this bill. And I think, for example, one area of streamlining of development consent orders that comes to mind is the very important issue of making sure that your development consent order is a one-stop shop. And there are some proposals to look again at the extent to which the development consent order is not currently a one-stop shop in terms of downstream other consents, permissions and licenses. And that is really important to ensure effective delivery of these projects once the main consent has been given. So I think that in relation to the involvement of communities, the system provides plenty of safeguards both before development consent is given and afterwards for communities to be appropriately involved. And you see time and time again when these applications are examined that the Planning Inspectorate are extremely keen to ensure that communities are involved properly in the examination process. So I don't think there's a problem in relation to involvement of communities, and I don't think any of these reforms would threaten that.
Right. Because of course, this planning reform is seen as a tool to, as I say, unleash billions in economic growth, which, arguably is going to have benefit right across the UK. But are there any additional measures that you think might ensure that planning reforms genuinely improve community outcomes, rather than just accelerating construction? I mentioned this idea to try to get more low-cost power to communities. Outcomes for communities is what it's all about. Any ideas there?
I think the best thing that can be done in terms of securing outcomes for communities is to two things, I think. First of all, as we touched on earlier, government needs to undertake a comprehensive review of community benefit generally. There's the proposal in the bill in relation to homes near electricity transmission projects, but that's clearly a very narrow category of infrastructure project. But we need to look at what a community benefit scheme should look like across all of the infrastructure sectors. Government needs to really commission some work here on some detailed guidance on this so applicants and developers know what the expectation is. So I think that's the most important thing that should be done.
Yeah, because that's that whole balance between nationally significant projects and what's actually valuable or seen as important for local communities, and it's always a challenge.
It is always a challenge. I think at the moment that the balance is not sufficiently towards the national significance of these projects and the need for them. And this government's been very effective at demonstrating and explaining the link between the need for these projects, cleaning up our power supply, and of course generating economic wealth. So I think that at the moment we don't yet have that correct balance.
Yeah. Well, the second big ambition for government, as I said earlier, is housing and overcoming the bottlenecks to delivering this 1.5 million new homes they want to try to achieve in the next 5 years. The grey belt, so-called grey belt land release policy, is a major shift in planning. Will it be enough to meet these housing targets, or does it risk again triggering yet more local opposition?
Well, I think this is a very complicated area, and of course, planning is not the only thing by any means, is it, that determines how these houses can be delivered. It's largely a private sector area of the economy, of course, and the bill makes a number of provisions in relation to aspects of the planning regime to assist with housing delivery. For example, it is reforming powers of development corporations, and that's been specifically said as being necessary to help with the housing challenge. I think certainly the green belt issue is helping. We're already seeing decisions coming through on that, because that was done through the revision to the National Planning Policy Framework last December. So that is making a difference. I think, though, that in terms of the major proposals yet to come, in terms of major urban extensions and new towns, there are some real challenges there in terms of how those major proposals will be delivered. And the bill doesn't really deal with that. And government, I think, is still thinking what is going to be the planning delivery mechanism for the new generation of new towns and these major urban extensions.
Well, there's been a lot of talk about compulsory purchase reforms, to boost this house building and infrastructure development. To be fair, and of course it engages suddenly everybody who's got a vested interest. Whether it's local community, whether it's farmers, and a lot of rows certainly hitting headlines over this so-called hope value, the potential value of having a development on it. I mean, do you think these compulsory purchase reforms will actually speed things up, or just increase the number of rows?
I mean, so the bill includes half a dozen or so measures to make a number of technical changes to the system of compulsory purchase orders, and then in relation to one change in relation to the rules relating to the assessment of compensation for compulsory purchase. I think a wider review is needed, and indeed the Law Commission is currently consulting on its own proposals for a much wider review. So this isn't the end of proposals in relation to compulsory purchase and compensation. And I think in relation to removing hope value, this is still a very recent development that has been brought in, and the bill slightly extends the ability to remove hope value from compulsory purchase orders. But I think this is a controversial area, there's no doubt about it. And again, I'm not convinced that we've seen the end of debate on this issue, because there are a lot of people who think it's deeply unfair.
Yeah. Well, some would also argue that the biggest issue facing infrastructure and housing planning isn't legislation, but it's under-resourced local planning authorities. Does this bill do enough to address that local planning problem?
No, I don't think it does. It's under-resourced local planning authorities. It's also under-resourced statutory consultees. But again, government is aware of this. But of course, it's a complex thing to fix. That there are, for example, a letter was published this week from the Deputy Prime Minister to local authorities proposing a number of changes to the statutory consultation route, which will certainly help, I think. Likewise, there is now provision in the bill for local authorities to set their own planning application fees. That's been called for some time. That will help resourcing as well. But ultimately, and this is the same problem when it comes to infrastructure delivery, there's a real skills issue here,
right?
Nationwide and across the different sectors of development and infrastructure. And
I imagine it's getting more and more technical, so those skills are changing.
Yes, it's getting more and more technical, and you've got some big developments which are going to be a real drain on skills. So, for example, the provisions in the bill to do with development and nature recovery and setting out this new system of environmental delivery plans to be run by Natural England and a related nature restoration levy. I think many listeners will have experienced Natural England's sort of paucity of resources, and therefore I think it's going to be essential that they get a good settlement in the spending review to allow them to deliver this new strategic approach to development and nature recovery, which is very much to be welcomed, but there's going to be a massive amount to be involved in implementing it. And we've seen how Natural England have difficulty in engaging on, for example, big infrastructure projects as it is, and they're now being given another job to put in place this strategic system for development and nature recovery. And I worry about how they're going to manage to do that with the resources they've got.
Yeah, well, given the scale of ambition for this government's infrastructure investment, and given the scale of the nation's ambition for environmental protection and the drive towards net zero, it strikes me, Robbie, you're going to be pretty busy for a while. I mean, just to go back to the top and just to wrap us up here, you said ministers need to go much further there to deliver on their infrastructure commitments. If you could amend one aspect of the bill to deliver faster, better, more sustainable infrastructure, or add something else that a bit later on, what would that be? What's still needed to make this all happen?
I think it goes back to that issue of where does the balance lie between national need and national benefit from these projects and local interest. And as I said earlier, I don't think the balance has been struck correctly yet. And the one change I would make would be to deal with the judicial review problem, which will persist, I believe, and the changes made by the bill will make a very minimal difference. And therefore, I think government needs to think about judicial review in two contexts. First of all, in relation to judicial review of national policy statements, why is it appropriate for national policy statements to be judicially reviewed, given that they are approved by Parliament? That's the first question I would like to be answered. And secondly, I would say in relation to those nationally significant projects that are of a critical national priority, so sort of a subset, if you like, it seems to me that government should consider giving Parliament a role to confirm decisions made by ministers to approve those projects. And it seems to me perfectly appropriate if Parliament does choose to confirm a decision in relation to a particular project, then Parliament is saying, we want this project to be delivered. And therefore, it's appropriate for that project then not to be able to be delayed or stopped through judicial review. And that would be the other change I would make.
Right. Well, let's see whether or not that particular idea gets picked up on and driven forward. Well, Robbie, clearly, as I said, there's a lot of work to do before this legislation really hits the statute books and before it starts making an impact. But thanks so much for taking time out of your busy MIPIN schedule to join me on the Infrastructure Podcast today to share your thinking and, of course, set out some of the actions that are needed. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Anthony. That's been a real pleasure. And yeah, there's a lot to be done, and looking forward to getting involved in the parliamentary process for the bill and seeing it get through Parliament. Of course, the bill's only part of the picture here. The bill deals with what is necessary by way of additional primary legislation, but there's a huge amount of activity going on here led by government, and we are looking forward to working with government to help the reform package as a whole to be progressed.
Great stuff. Well, we'll have a great rest of MIPIN in the sunshine. As I say, there's lots for you to do, and lots, of course, for you to do with NIPA, the National Infrastructure Planning Association, as you really try to get to grips with the complexities and the opportunities from this bill. So, thanks for joining me, Robbie. Unfortunately, that's all we've got time for right now on the Infrastructure Podcast. There is more in the pipeline as we continue to probe the big issues faced across the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you will find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So, thanks for joining us. Thanks again to Robbie, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.